moved into this apartment after the divorce, when my life collapsed like a house of cards. My wife took almost everything: furniture, dishes, even the photos from our shared travels, leaving me with just a computer, a few boxes of personal belongings, and an emptiness I couldn't fill. The apartment on the fourth floor of an old Soviet-era panel building was cheap. The previous tenant had left in the middle of the night, abandoning even the furniture. The real estate agent shrugged nervously when I asked about the reasons for such a hurried departure, but it suited me. After the division of assets and lawyer fees, I had little money left, and starting life over at 35 turned out to be far harder than I'd naively thought. Every morning, I woke up with the thought that I had to claw my way out of this pit, to find meaning in this new reality. But the days blended into a monotonous gray haze. Working as a programmer allowed me to stay home, which was both a blessing and a curse. On one hand, I didn't have to waste time commuting or money on the business suits I used to wear daily. On the other, the walls of the empty apartment pressed in on me with every passing hour, reminding me of what my life had become. I woke up at 7 in the morning, not because of an alarm, but out of a habit ingrained from years of married life. Only now, there was no one to brew coffee for two. Standing in the kitchen in an old robe, I'd stare out the window at the gray courtyard between the buildings, thinking about how, at this hour, Marina would already be bustling about, getting ready for work. Now, the apartment was filled with a dead silence, broken only by the hum of the fridge and the distant noise of the avenue. The first few weeks, I tried to settle into a new rhythm, to create some order out of the chaos the divorce had left behind. Wake up, shower, breakfast by the window with a view of identical gray panel buildings. It helped me avoid dwelling on the past or making plans for a future that seemed just as bleak as the view outside. I'd sit at my computer by the living room window. There was no better spot to work in the apartment, and the light was decent even on cloudy days. Code flowed onto the screen, line after line, like the autumn rain outside. Freelance gigs came in regularly. My reputation as a solid programmer, built over years, hadn't suffered from my personal troubles. But I increasingly caught myself staring not at the monitor but at the window across the way, where another family lived their own lives with their own problems. In the apartment directly opposite mine lived a family of 3. I'd catch glimpses of them during work breaks or when I looked away from the screen to rest my eyes. A middle-aged woman with long dark hair, never tied back or braided, a man about my age with a neat dark beard, and a boy, maybe 10 years old, thin and pale. An ordinary family, like those in every building in our neighborhood, unremarkable at first glance. Sometimes I envied them. They had a reason to get up in the morning, someone waiting for them at home in the evening, someone who cared for them and needed their care. Meanwhile, I'd return from the grocery store to an empty apartment where my footsteps echoed on the parquet left by the previous tenant, and no one cared how my day went or what I thought about tomorrow. Evenings were the hardest when loneliness hit with particular force. I'd finish work around 8, when it was already dark outside, and make a simple dinner, usually pasta with sausages, scrambled eggs with bread, or reheated frozen dumplings. Then I'd sit down to eat in front of the old TV left by the previous owner. News gave way to series, series to commercials, commercials to talk shows, all blending into a meaningless background meant to drown out the silence and my thoughts about how life had passed me by. After dinner, I'd wash the dishes, standing at the kitchen window and watching the city lights flicker on in the dusk, turning the panel buildings into glowing boxes filled with other people's lives. Sometimes I wondered what would have happened if I'd tried harder to save the marriage, paid more attention to Marina, spent less time at the computer, and more with family. But those thoughts only deepened the emptiness in my chest and left a bitter taste in my mouth. Before bed, I developed a strange habit I couldn't explain. I'd drink a glass of milk, standing at the kitchen window and staring at the stars, barely visible through the city smog. I don't know where it came from. Maybe from childhood, when my mom gave me warm milk with honey before bed, but the ritual calmed me, helping me forget the day's anxieties and prepare for sleep. The milk was cold, the stars distant, and my thoughts about tomorrow relentlessly grim. It would be just like today. Work, loneliness, TV, sleep, in an endless cycle with no way out. Standing at the window with the glass in my hand, I thought about how my life had become an endless repetition of the same meaningless actions, devoid of joy, and I didn't know how to change it or find anything positive in it. It was during these evening musings at the kitchen window that I first noticed something strange, which at first seemed like a mere coincidence. As I stood with my milk, staring at the city lights and reflecting on my failed life, the woman from the family across the way would appear at her window. She too held something white, a mug or a glass, I couldn't tell in the evening light, and stared in my direction, as if lost in her own thoughts. At first I thought it was just a coincidence. People can have similar habits, especially those living in identical apartments in typical buildings, where life's rhythm is dictated by architecture and layout. Maybe she also had trouble sleeping, or she liked to sit in the quiet kitchen, reflecting on the day or planning for tomorrow. There was nothing unusual about it, and I dismissed it as a fluke. But then I started noticing other coincidences that gradually formed a disturbing pattern. In the morning, when I turned on the living room light and went to brew coffee in the kitchen, the light in the apartment across the way would also flick on, as if someone was mirroring my actions with a slight delay. When I sat at my computer by the window, the man from the family would appear at a table in their apartment, hunched over something, a book, papers, or maybe a computer. When I stood up to stretch, my habit was to do a few squats every half hour to loosen my stiff legs and back. He, too, would stand and make movements I couldn't quite make out but which seemed to mirror mine. At first, these coincidences amused me, adding a bit of variety to my monotonous life and giving me something to distract myself from the tedious work and grim thoughts about the future. I started deliberately watching the family across the way, finding more interest in it than in work or TV shows. It was better than endlessly replaying thoughts about how I'd ruined my life, destroyed my marriage, and what would come next. At 35, my programming career brought stable income but no real satisfaction or sense of purpose, and my personal life lay in ruins after the divorce. At least the neighbors' odd behavior provided some entertainment and food for thought beyond self-pity and introspection. Observing them became a sort of hobby, filling the void in my life and giving me a sense of connection to others, even if it was one-sided and imagined. I began noticing details of their daily life, trying to guess their professions, interests, and family dynamics, weaving stories about them in my head. But after a week of this, amusement turned into growing unease when I realized the coincidences went beyond mere chance. They weren't just living on a similar schedule or sharing similar habits. They were copying me with eerie precision. When I got up mid-workday to make a sandwich in the kitchen, the woman would also go to prepare something, appearing at the stove just as I pulled bread from the bag. When I leaned down to grab something from the bottom drawer of my desk, the man across the way would lean down too, mirroring my movement with a slight delay. When I scratched my head, puzzling over a tricky coding problem or hunting for a bug, he'd raise his hand to his head, mimicking the gesture. This couldn't be coincidence anymore. Too many things happened too often to be explained by shared habits or lifestyles. I became more cautious, analyzing my every move and watching the neighbors' reactions. After work, instead of mindlessly watching TV or aimlessly wandering the apartment, I'd sit by the living room window and study the building across the way. It looked perfectly ordinary, a Soviet-era panel building like mine, with the same windows, balconies, and entrances. But the apartment directly opposite mine felt different. It glowed with a strange light, not brighter or a different color than the other windows, but somehow unnatural, as if it didn't come from ordinary lamps but from some other source. Maybe it was because I was staring too intently, or maybe it was my frayed nerves, but the light in their windows seemed artificial, uncanny. One evening, when exhaustion from a particularly grueling day wrapped around me like a heavy blanket, I decided to conduct a real experiment. The client was demanding a complete overhaul of the project. The deadline was looming, and I could feel the tension building in my neck and shoulders. My head throbbed from the bright glare of the monitor and the endless lines of code blurring before my eyes. Around 9 o'clock, I set work aside, brewed a strong cup of tea, and sat by the living room window, determined to figure out what was happening with the neighbors across the way. Their building looked calm and ordinary. Most windows glowed with soft, homely light, with occasional silhouettes of people going about their evening routines. But the apartment directly opposite mine was dark, as if its occupants had gone out or gone to bed. I waited a few minutes, sipping the hot tea and wondering if I was just paranoid, worn down by the divorce and loneliness, and if all these coincidences were just figments of my overworked imagination. But the moment I stood up and turned on my desk lamp, a warm light flicked on in the apartment across the way. Not the main ceiling light or a chandelier, but a desk lamp by the window, just like mine. My heart raced, my hands trembling slightly as I switched my lamp off, and the light across the way went out instantly, as if someone was watching my every move and copying it immediately. I turned it back on. It lit up. Off, it went dark. On again, and it glowed again. With the same 3 to 4 second delay I'd started noticing in all their actions. Tea splashed onto the floor as my hands shook with the realization that something utterly inexplicable and terrifying was happening. This was no coincidence. Someone was watching me, studying every movement, every gesture, every habit, and I had no idea who they were or why. I decided to try something more deliberate and obvious. I stepped close to the window, my face almost touching the glass, and waved broadly, theatrically, so the gesture would be unmistakable even in the evening light. After a few agonizingly long seconds, a figure appeared in the lit window across the way, the woman with long dark hair, and she waved back with the exact same motion. Not a friendly neighborly wave, but an exact replica of my gesture. The same amplitude, the same duration, the same rhythm. My heart pounded so loudly I could hear it in the silent apartment, and a chill ran down my spine. I quickly stepped back from the window, but I couldn't shake the image from my mind. Her movement wasn't a human greeting. It was a mechanical imitation, as if she were a marionette controlled by invisible strings, forced to mirror my every action. That night, sleep didn't come until dawn. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, wondering what was happening in the apartment across the way during those dark hours. Did they sleep like normal people? Or did they stand by their windows in complete darkness, waiting for me to get up for a glass of water or a trip to the bathroom so they could mimic me? Several times, I crept to the window on tiptoes, careful not to turn on the light or give myself away, to see what was happening across the way. Each time I saw the same thing: a faint, unnatural light in their apartment and a motionless figure at the window, staring in my direction. Sometimes it was the woman, sometimes the man, but most often it was the child, his thin silhouette barely discernible in the darkness. They didn't move, didn't shift positions, just stood there like sentinels, waiting. And that was far more terrifying than any overt action. Over the next few days, I tried to disrupt their mimicking system to throw off whoever was watching me. Instead of my usual measured routine, I started doing chaotic, nonsensical things, turning the light on and off without reason, opening and closing the window repeatedly, pacing the room in zigzags, stopping abruptly to freeze for a minute, then spinning around and walking in another direction. I hoped this unpredictable behavior would confuse them, make them slip up, or at least show they couldn't copy everything. But my hopes were dashed. They continued to replicate every move with the same mechanical precision, even the most absurd and pointless actions, always with that few-second delay. When I hopped on one leg in the middle of the living room, the man across the way hopped too. When I clapped my hands over my head, the woman did the same. Even my attempts to trick them turned into a grotesque parody of normal human behavior. Then I decided to try direct communication, though the very idea filled me with dread and revulsion. I took a large sheet of printer paper, wrote, "Who are you?" in bold black marker, and taped it to my window so it was clearly visible from across the way. For a few minutes, nothing happened. I stood by the window, staring at their apartment, waiting for a response. Then in their window, an identical white sheet appeared with the exact same words, written in the same handwriting, with the same marker. My question came back to me like an echo in an empty hall. The next day I wrote, "Stop it," and got the same message in return. Then, "I know you're watching." And again, my own words were mirrored back. They didn't answer my questions or engage in dialogue. They just reflected my words, turning my attempt at communication into a meaningless exchange with myself. With each passing day, my fear grew, as I realized they weren't just watching me out of idle curiosity or malice. They were studying me with the methodical precision of scientists observing a lab animal. Every move, every habit, every gesture was recorded and replicated with mathematical accuracy. But why? What were they doing with this information? And most importantly, who were they? They looked like an ordinary family, but their behavior had nothing to do with normal human life. It was as if they existed solely to mirror me, as if their own existence was paused, only coming to life when I moved. I decided to observe their lives more closely, to see what they did when they weren't copying me. It turned out they had almost no independent life. The woman cooked only when I did, preparing the exact same dishes I chose. The man worked at his table only when I worked, otherwise sitting motionless, staring at nothing. The child played only when I rested, read when I read, and spent most of his time standing at the window, staring at me with an unblinking gaze. It was as if their own lives, their personalities, their human essence were entirely devoted to mimicking mine. They didn't live. They reflected my life, like a mirror reflects the person standing before it. The most chilling discovery came by accident. One evening while drinking coffee during work, my ceramic mug slipped from my hands and shattered on the floor, shards scattering across the kitchen. I cursed under my breath, bending down to pick up the sharp pieces, and glanced at the window across the way. The man in that apartment was also bent over his kitchen floor, but his face wasn't annoyed or concerned, as you'd expect from someone who dropped a dish. It was contorted in genuine pain, physical pain, as if the shards were cutting not my floor, but his body. His mouth was open in a silent scream, eyes shut, body tensed as if in agony. When I stood up, he stood too, and the pain vanished from his face, replaced by the usual emotionless mask. But for a few seconds, I saw something that made me realize the connection between us went far beyond mere mimicry. They weren't just copying my actions. They were somehow feeling what I felt. My emotions, my physical pain, maybe even my thoughts were transmitted to them through some invisible link I couldn't understand or explain. This realization terrified me more than anything else because it meant I wasn't just an object of observation but a source of influence on them. Every time I felt pain, sadness, exhaustion, or irritation, they experienced it too. Every time I made a sudden move or stumbled, they mirrored it, possibly feeling discomfort or even suffering. I was tied to them by invisible threads that made them my marionettes, but I didn't know how to control those threads or want to cause them pain. For several days I tried to move carefully, gently, avoiding sudden actions, not dropping things, not doing anything that might cause them discomfort. But this only heightened my anxiety and sense of responsibility for what was happening. I hadn't asked for this connection, didn't want to affect the lives of strangers, but every action I took impacted them, and their existence depended entirely on my behavior. Sleep became even harder. I lay in bed, wondering what they were doing in those hours, whether they were waiting for me to wake up to resume their eerie dance of mimicry. Food lost its taste. Work brought no satisfaction, and every glance out the window reminded me that my life no longer belonged to me alone. Finally, I made a decision that had been brewing for days. I had to go to them, confront these people face to face, and figure out what was happening. Maybe they were unaware of what was going on. Or maybe they were victims of the same strange phenomenon as I was. A direct conversation might help us find a way to break this mystical bond and return to normal lives. I couldn't keep living in this atmosphere of constant observation and mimicry, unable to work, eat, or sleep peacefully, knowing my every move was being replicated across the way. I had to act, not just observe and analyze. On Saturday morning, as rain drummed against the windows and a heavy gray sky pressed down on the city, I made up my mind to take direct action. All week, I've been preparing for this moment, rehearsing every word I'd say, every question I'd ask. My heart beat unevenly. My hands trembled slightly as I got dressed, grabbed my keys, and left the apartment. The stairwell smelled of dampness and old paint, the light on the third floor flickering, creating a tense atmosphere. I stepped out into the courtyard, where puddles reflected the murky sky, and slowly walked toward the building across the way, trying not to think about what I might find. Maybe it would be simpler than I thought, and we could resolve this like civilized people. Maybe they were unaware of what was happening and would be as shocked as I was to learn about the strange connection between us. But deep down, I felt it wouldn't be that easy. And whatever I discovered in their apartment would change my understanding of everything. The entrance to their building was identical to mine. Peeling walls, metal mailboxes, the same smell, and the same dreary atmosphere of a Soviet-era high-rise. I climbed to the 4th floor, where their apartment should be, and stopped in front of a door with a number matching the windows I'd been watching. An ordinary metal door, upholstered in brown faux leather, with a peephole and 2 locks. Nothing unusual or alarming. But as I raised my hand to press the doorbell, a strange feeling washed over me, as if I stood on the threshold of something better left undisturbed. The air in the stairwell felt thicker, heavier than usual, and the silence was so complete I could hear my own breathing and heartbeat. For a few seconds I hesitated, wondering if I should turn back, forget this whole thing, and try to live on, ignoring the neighbors' bizarre behavior. But curiosity and the need for answers overcame my fear. I pressed the doorbell and heard a melodic chime deep inside the apartment. Then came a silence so long I began to think no one was home, though I knew that was impossible. I'd seen them in their windows just that morning. Finally, I heard footsteps. Slow, heavy, as if someone was walking reluctantly or with great effort. A lock clicked, then another, and the door opened a crack, held by a chain. A sliver of a face appeared in the gap. A woman's eye, part of a cheek, a strand of dark hair. The eye stared at me, unblinking, expressionless, as if studying every feature of my face. No questions about who I was or what I wanted, no surprise at an unfamiliar visitor, just that intense, appraising gaze that made me feel uneasy. We stood in silence for a few seconds, studying each other through the narrow gap, and I realized I'd have to speak first, as she clearly wasn't going to ask questions or invite me in. I introduced myself, explaining that I lived in the building across the way, in the apartment whose windows faced theirs, and that I'd noticed some oddities in their family's behavior. I spoke carefully, trying not to sound accusatory or aggressive, not wanting to scare her or provoke hostility. I explained that they seemed to be mimicking my actions, and I wanted to know if it was intentional or accidental, and whether we could do something about it. As I spoke, her eye didn't blink. Her face showed no change. She just listened, as if recording every word in her memory. When I finished, there was another long pause, filled only by the sound of rain outside the stairwell windows and the distant hum of cars on the avenue. Then the chain rattled as it was unhooked, the locks clicked, and the door slowly opened, revealing the entrance to the apartment. The woman stepped back into the dimly lit hallway, silently inviting me in, and I crossed the threshold, pushing down a growing sense of unease. The hallway was exactly like mine. Same dimensions, same layout, same design. But the atmosphere was entirely different. The air felt denser, as if saturated with invisible particles, and the light was muted, strange, though the lamps burned just as brightly as in my home. The walls were painted the same color as mine. The furniture stood in the same places. Even the pictures on the walls were similar. Too similar. I realized their apartment was an exact replica of mine, down to the smallest details. The same wallpaper, the same furniture, the same decor. It was as if someone had copied my apartment and recreated it here with photographic precision. The woman walked ahead of me down the corridor, her movements smooth but unnatural, as if she were moving underwater or in slow motion. Her long, dark hair swayed with her steps, but even that motion seemed mechanical, programmed. We entered the living room, and I saw the rest of the family. The man sat at the table in the same posture I used when working, slightly hunched forward, hands on the tabletop, gaze fixed downward. The child stood at the window with his back to me, looking toward my building. Neither turned when we entered, neither greeted me, nor showed any interest in the stranger in their home. They continued their tasks as if I wasn't there. The living room was identical to mine. Same sofa, same table, same arrangement of furniture, same books on the shelves. Even the mess was replicated with precision. A stack of papers on the table tilted at the same angle as in my apartment. A mug placed where I usually left my coffee cup. This wasn't just similarity. It was an absolute copy of my life, transplanted into someone else's space. I tried to speak to the man, asking direct questions about what was happening, why they were mimicking me, whether they knew about the strange connection between us. But he didn't respond, didn't lift his head, didn't move. I turned to the child by the window, but he didn't answer either, didn't even turn to face me. Only the woman looked at me, her gaze empty, vacant, as if she were looking through me at something behind me. None of them spoke the entire time I was there, and I gradually realized they either couldn't speak, didn't want to, or didn't understand human language. Their silence wasn't just a refusal to communicate. It was absolute, total, as if they'd lost the ability to speak, or never had it. I decided to test my theory about their mimicking right there in their presence. I slowly raised my right hand and waved it in the air. The woman instantly mirrored the gesture with the same few-second delay. I clapped my hands. She clapped. I took a step to the left. She stepped to the left. Every move was copied with mechanical precision, but her eyes showed no understanding or awareness of what she was doing. She moved like an automaton, programmed to replicate my actions without will or intent. The man and child began mimicking some of my movements too, though their responses were less precise, as if the signal reached them with interference or distortion. The child turned from the window and looked at me for the first time, and what I saw in his eyes made me shudder. There was no childish curiosity or fear of a stranger, just emptiness, a cold, bottomless void, as if there was no soul behind those eyes. I tried to approach the window to look at my building from their side, and saw something that convinced me this went beyond human possibilities. In the window of my apartment, in the very living room where I spent my days working, stood my own figure. I saw myself standing at my window, though I was here, in the building across the way. The figure in my apartment mirrored my movements, raising its hand when I raised mine, turning its head when I turned mine. But this wasn't a reflection or an optical illusion. It was an exact copy of me, standing in my own apartment, replicating my actions from the other side. The world flipped upside down in my mind. Reality cracked like a shattered mirror, and I realized I was trapped in something I might never escape. Panic hit me like a wave. My breathing quickened, my heart raced so fast I felt dizzy. I bolted for the door, not looking back at the strange family, not saying goodbye, not explaining my sudden exit. I had to get back to my apartment immediately to check what was happening, to ensure my own life hadn't become part of this nightmare. The family didn't try to stop me or follow me to the door. They remained in the same positions I'd left them in, as if my visit was just a brief interruption in their endless waiting. I ran out of their building into the rain, soaked to the bone by the time I reached my own, and climbed the stairs to my apartment, leaping 2 steps at a time, gasping from fear and physical exertion. When I opened the door to my apartment, it felt unfamiliar, alien, as if I'd stepped not into my home but into yet another copy of it. Everything was in its place. Nothing had changed, but the atmosphere was different. Colder, emptier, stripped of the warmth and comfort that make a place a home. I approached the living room window and looked at the building across the way. In the window of the apartment I'd just visited stood the same 3 figures: woman, man, and child. They stared at me with motionless gazes, and I thought I saw them smile, though at that distance I couldn't make out their expressions. But something in their postures, the tilt of their heads, the way they stood, told me they were pleased with the outcome of my visit. Pleased that I'd learned part of the truth, but not all of it, and was now more confused and terrified than ever. In the days that followed, I tried to return to normal life, but it was impossible. Work was a struggle. I kept getting distracted, glancing at the window to check if someone across the way was mimicking my movements. Every sound in the apartment made me jump. Every shadow outside seemed suspicious. I started closing the curtains during the day to avoid seeing the building opposite, but that only intensified the feeling of confinement and hopelessness. In the dimness of the shuttered apartment, I felt like I was in a coffin, and thoughts about what was happening outside grew even more obsessive and terrifying. Sleep came in fits and starts, and even in my dreams, I was haunted by images of that strange family, their empty eyes and their mechanical movements. I tried to find an explanation online, reading articles about mental disorders, paranoia, and hallucinations. Maybe the divorce and loneliness had driven me to a nervous breakdown, and all these coincidences were just in my fractured mind. Maybe the family across the way was living an utterly normal life, and I was projecting my fears and fantasies onto them. But every time I cracked the curtain and looked at their windows, reality shattered my attempts at rational explanation. They were still there, still copying my every move, still standing motionless at their windows in the dark hours. This wasn't a hallucination or a product of a sick imagination. It was real, terrifying, and inexplicable, but undeniably real. I decided to try a different approach. Instead of trying to understand or stop what was happening, I attempted to accept it as a fact of life and learn to live with it. After all, they weren't causing me direct harm, weren't threatening me, weren't trying to break into my apartment. They were just mimicking my actions, and maybe there was nothing malicious or dangerous about it. Perhaps this was their way of existing, their purpose, and I needed to treat it like a natural phenomenon, something I couldn't change but could accept. For a few days I tried to act naturally, ignoring the windows across the way, focusing on work and daily tasks. But pretending to ignore the situation only heightened my inner tension and the sense of unreality. Then I decided to attempt contact, not through notes or gestures, but through subtler means. If they were truly linked to me by some mystical connection, perhaps they could perceive not just my physical actions, but my thoughts, emotions, and intentions. I began addressing them mentally, sending them silent messages, asking them to explain what was happening, who they were, and what they wanted from me. Sitting by the window with my eyes closed, I focused on transmitting my thoughts, imagining my words crossing the space between our buildings and reaching their minds. I spent hours trying to establish this mental connection, but there was no response. They remained silent, kept mimicking, continued existing in their strange, inaccessible world beyond human understanding. Gradually, I noticed my own sense of self beginning to blur under the weight of this constant connection. I started forgetting which actions were mine by choice, and which were driven by the feeling that someone was watching and copying me. Sometimes it felt like I wasn't moving because I wanted to, but because something was compelling me to move so it could be copied. The line between my will and their influence faded, and I couldn't tell where I ended and they began. Perhaps the connection was mutual. Not only were they copying me, but I was becoming their copy, losing my individuality and merging into their strange collective existence. One sleepless night, tormented by insomnia, I got up and approached the window without turning on the light. Outside was pitch black. The streetlights were out due to a power station failure, and the building opposite was shrouded in darkness. But in their apartment window, that same unnatural light glowed faintly. And in that light, I saw not 3 family members, but countless figures. Dozens, maybe hundreds of silhouettes standing in tight rows, all staring at me. They were identical in height, posture, and outline, as if they were copies of a single being multiplied endlessly, and they all moved in sync with me, raising their hands when I raised mine, turning their heads when I turned mine. This wasn't a family of 3. It was an army of copies, an infinite array of reflections, each tied to me by invisible threads. The horror I felt in that moment defies words. I realized I hadn't just stumbled into a strange situation with odd neighbors. I was trapped in something far larger than I could comprehend. These beings were multiplying, using my presence as a catalyst, growing in number each day. Perhaps they had already filled not just one apartment but the entire building, maybe even the whole district, creating endless copies of themselves and of me. I wasn't just an object of observation. I was the source of their proliferation, the nourishment allowing them to exist and multiply daily. The next morning I made the only decision that seemed possible. I had to leave, to physically break the connection by moving to another city, or better yet, another country, somewhere they couldn't find me and continue their mimicking. I started packing, preparing to leave, searching for rental options in other cities. My work could be done remotely from anywhere with internet, and a new environment might help me forget this nightmare and start over. But as I gathered documents and essentials, sounds from outside stopped my heart. Footsteps, countless footsteps, moving in unison across the courtyard between the buildings. I looked out the window and saw them. Dozens of figures marching in formation from the building opposite toward my entrance. They moved slowly, deliberately, like soldiers in a parade, all dressed identically in dark clothing that made them nearly indistinguishable in the gray light of the overcast day. Men, women, children, all with the same faces, same expressions, same movements. They reached my building and stopped, forming neat rows in the courtyard. Then they raised their heads and looked at my window. Hundreds of identical faces, hundreds of identical eyes, staring at me with infinite patience and expectation. They didn't shout, didn't wave, didn't demand I come out. They just stood and waited, as if they knew I'd come to them eventually. I retreated from the window and locked myself in the bathroom, the only room without a window facing the courtyard. Sitting on the cold tile floor back against the wall, I tried to think of an escape plan. Maybe if I waited until dark, I could slip out through the basement or the fire escape. Maybe they'd leave if they realized I wasn't coming out. But deep down, I knew it was futile. Wherever I went, they'd find me. The connection was too deep to be severed by a mere change of location. They were part of me, and I was part of them, and this bond would persist until we all vanished or merged into one being. The clock ticked on the bathroom wall, counting down to the inevitable end of this story. I knew resistance was pointless, that sooner or later, I'd have to accept what was happening and join their world. Maybe this wasn't punishment or a curse. Maybe it was evolution, the next step in human development, where individual boundaries dissolve and all consciousnesses merge into one collective existence. Perhaps my loneliness and alienation after the divorce weren't random, but preparation for this moment, when I'd have to let go of my separateness and become part of something greater. When darkness fell, I left the bathroom and approached the living room window. They were still there, but now there were even more. The courtyard was filled with motionless figures, their numbers growing. They emerged from the darkness, stepped out of other entrances, descended from rooftops, as if the entire district was overrun with these beings, waiting for a signal to gather. I opened the window and shouted, "What do you want?" They didn't answer. Instead, they all raised their hands and pointed at me in unison, a gesture so coordinated it left no doubt. They had come for me. I went downstairs and they parted, forming a corridor from the entrance to the center of the courtyard. Walking between them, I felt their gazes, but none tried to stop or speak to me. They just watched, waited, allowing me to take the final step myself. In the center of the courtyard was a circle drawn in chalk, and they silently pointed to it. I understood I had to stand in it. When I did, they began moving, forming concentric circles around me. Their movements were slow, rhythmic, creating a hypnotic effect I couldn't look away from. Gradually, I felt my individuality dissolving into their collective consciousness. My thoughts became their thoughts, my emotions their emotions, my memories their memories. But it wasn't painful or frightening. On the contrary, for the first time in months since the divorce, I didn't feel alone. I was part of something greater, something that understood me without words and accepted me without judgment. My past, my mistakes, my pain, all dissolved in a shared ocean of experience where no one's pain was unique and no one's happiness was exclusive. When dawn broke, I was the only one left in the courtyard. But I was no longer myself. I was all of them and none of them at once. I returned to the apartment, which now felt like a place I'd once lived but was no longer my home. I sat at the computer and began writing this story, knowing someone had to tell what happened. When I finish, I'll go back to the courtyard, where the others are waiting, and we'll seek the next lonely person who needs to join our unity. Because loneliness is an illusion, and true life begins only when you cease to be just yourself and become everyone else.